I'm Jackie of Alchemical Cosplay, and this is my tutorial on how to sew gloves. These are my Sorceress Gloves. I've made them with a faux leather that has a two-way stretch. It has a metallic cuff with a gem that you can Velcro open, and it has a faux fur cuff at the bottom. Gloves are one of the trickiest things that I've had to sew in my costume making career to date. They have to fit you really well. You have to be able to touch things, pick things up, and if they're uncomfortable, they can really ruin your day. So I'd like to show you some tips and tricks that I've picked up making many pairs of gloves over the years, and I'm going to show you how I use my Pfaff Performance Icon machine to make this process smooth and as perfect as possible.
The Performance Icon machine has a lot of features that make precision sewing much easier. It has a wide range of stitches. I used primarily a straight stitch for these gloves, as well as a wobble stitch, a zigzag stitch, and elastic zigzag stitch. There's a speed control slider on the side of this machine, which lets you increase and decrease the speed as you sew for very careful curves. The needle down button lets you pivot your fabric in place, and then the presser foot up has extra lift if you hit it twice. If you hit the foot down button twice, it gives you a little bit of extra space to position your fabric. The IDT system is one of my favorite parts of a Pfaff machine. This is a feed dog that feeds your fabric from the top. This ensures you have evenly fed fabric from the bottom as well as the top, so your seams are smooth and even. Your fabric does not crawl or shift as you sew. And here is the glove pattern I've been working with. It's deceptively simple with only a few pattern pieces. Mine also has a cuff at the bottom for the fur piece, and these are fourchettes which go between your fingers. I am also using a gusseted thumb, which has this little extra piece that makes it more comfortable to wear, but trickier to sew. This glove pattern is a hybrid of ones that I've used over the years, where I took my favorite components and fused them together to create a pattern custom to me. It fits my hand really well and is not so hard to sew compared to some of the instructions that come with commercial patterns I've tried. It has still space for elastic across the wrist, and I've added Velcro here for the cuff attachment, which is very specific to the design that I'm working with for this costume. The material I like working with best for gloves is a faux leather with a nice suede back. It also has a two-way stretch that makes wearing your gloves a little bit more forgiving. As much as I like real leather, this stuff is great. If you cut it with the stretch going across your palm, it's much more comfortable to wear because this is the area of your hand that gets the most movement, and it's important that it'll flex throughout the day as you wear it. Be aware of the grain line and the direction of the stretch while you're placing your patterns for cutting, and also make sure to flip your pattern so you have a left and a right glove instead of two lefts or two right gloves. I'm using a metallic pen to trace around my pattern on the right side of this material because it's a lot easier to see, and this pen washes out easily with just a little bit of water. Try to be very careful and precise with your tracing, including all the way down to the end of the cuts between the fingers and in the thumb hole. Because this pattern has a 1/16 seam allowance, any wobbles or misdrawn lines can affect the end result of your glove a lot more than you'd think. So now I've got my left and my right pieces all transferred and all the markings on there, and I'm about ready to cut this out. The last pattern to trace is this lovely faux fur. It has a nice long pile to it. I've decided to cut the pile facing downward toward the end of the glove or my elbow. And when you're cutting faux fur, try to cut just through the knit backing, not the fur underneath. This will keep your workspace a little clearer, although you still will get fuzzies everywhere, so be careful. And angle your scissors up when you're cutting to keep the point of your scissors as much as you can out of the fur as you cut. So just snip through the backing really carefully, and this will minimize the amount of fur you get everywhere, but it certainly will not eliminate it. So get your vacuum and your lint roller ready. I made the jeweled bracelet cuff for my glove next so that it would be ready to insert into my glove later. I did that by starting with a paper pattern which fit around my wrist, and it had a space where the jewel will sit in the middle, like so. And then, inspired by jewelry, I made a smaller piece. It's just a little smaller than the circumference of the gem, and this sits on top like a bezel setting of a ring or other jewelry. So I cut the cuff pattern out of a metallic lamb leather, and I used a shinier foil leather for underneath the gem. You could also use craft foil or essentially any other shiny surface to put under your gem. Could have even used the metallic lamb leather, but I wasn't a big fan of the grainy texture underneath there. So shiny it is. In this next step, I just trimmed the shiny foil so it would fit better under the gem and not be visible at the edges. Now I'm going to use my favorite secret weapon, contact cement. I started working with this glue as I learned more about leather craft. It is pretty toxic, so make sure you ventilate your workspace well, but it's excellent at securing seams where you can't pin them or just don't want to pin them. I'm using it here just to secure the shiny piece of foiled leather onto my lamb leather cuff. It doesn't gum up the needle of your machine, so you can stitch right through this once it's dry and use it for many other purposes, such as bonding materials together. Here I'm adding contact cement to a back of sulpa, which is essentially leather cardboard. You stick it onto the back of your lamb leather, which is quite soft, and then trim them together to give a smooth edge. Essentially, this is interfacing my bezel piece so it will be strong enough to hold the gem in place. I'm also going to use it to back the cuff to some 2mm black EVA foam. This gives the cuff a bit more weight and stability. It also gives the cuff a nice black background to sit into my glove color and not be so noticeable. So here I'm just rubbing it gently to bond it to the EVA foam. I'm going to cut it out really roughly and stitch it to make it a permanent bond. Sew around just the inner edge of the bezel piece now, because later we're going to be sewing the outer edge to the rest of the cuff to secure it. Top stitch around the edge of the foil piece and then the edge of the cuff itself to secure the lamb leather to the EVA foam and around the edge of the foil to keep this in place permanently. With the wristband all stitched to the EVA foam, go ahead and trim it flush. You can even trim a little bit of the lamb leather along with it to give it a really smooth edge. With both the bezel and the cuff top stitched and trimmed, now is the best time to add edge paint. I use brown acrylic paint because I like the antique finish that it gives to the gold metallic. Using a flat, stiff, bristled brush, dab your paint onto the edge to disguise the paler cut edge of the leather. It also hides any backing materials you used to reinforce your leather, such as the salt ball on the bezel and the EVA foam on the cuff. As you can see, I'm not being very precious about how I apply the paint, and I'm using my finger to blend the paint toward the stitch line for an antiqued metal effect. I really love the effect that the combination of dark edge paint and antiquing give my metallic leather accessories, and I use it on almost everything, even though it's kind of a tedious process. I believe that the end results are worth it. You can see there's a really drastic difference between the cut leather edge and the black EVA foam on the cuff. So this is where I think it's really important to apply edge paint to blend these together to give a really nicely finished product. Break out the contact cement and run a fine line around the edge of your bezel and where it will meet the cuff. I have decanted my contact cement into a fine tipped squeeze bottle for this project, specifically so you can do really precise application. When your contact cement is tacky, take the bezel and push it down over the gem to trap the gem in place. Because you're using leather, it will stretch slightly, but the stitch line you've placed around the inner edge of the bezel will prevent the leather from stretching too much and allowing the gem to fall out. Give your glue another good press around the edges, and then you'll be ready to take it to the sewing machine to stitch around the outer edge. I'm using the zipper foot for the machine and have moved the needle position to the left so I can get a stitch very close to the edge of the shape and not have the foot interfering with the domed shape of the gem. Now we're almost finished with the metallic gem cuff. I might decide to add another coat of edge paint to smooth these up a little bit, but really all I'm going to do is trim those threads and go ahead and add some Velcro to the end so this will attach to the underside of the wrist of my glove. With the cuff assembled and all the pieces cut out, it's finally time to start sewing up your glove. I would highly recommend keeping pattern pieces for the left and right sides of your glove separate, as there are some fine details in the fourchettes and also the thumbs that can be hard to identify as you're sewing, so it's easier to just keep them separate to avoid confusion. I now assemble my gloves differently than the commercial patterns I was working with suggest, but one of the things we both agree on is to start with the thumb. Fold this piece in half and sew along the edge down to the cut in the side of the pattern. Like working with real leather, I prefer to use contact cement around the edges to keep my seam allowances aligned instead of using pins while sewing. Using a fine tipped squeeze bottle, apply your contact cement around the edges just in the seam allowances. You can carefully add contact cement all around the edges of your thumb pattern and also the thumb hole opening on your glove at this point. It's important to let the contact cement dry before you press your seam allowances together. If it is wet while you push them together, the bond will not be as strong and the seams may come open as you are sewing. I think this is a great feature of contact cement though, as you can take your time while gluing and not worry about it drying out before you get a chance to apply it. So once your glue has dried down and is tacky, just push your seam allowances together along the edge you wish to sew. Go slowly and carefully and try not to let edges touch that you don't want to be connected. This glue is very strong. Next we will go to the sewing machine and run a straight stitch along this edge. Here's where quite a few of the great features of the Performance Icon come into play. First of all, when you put your foot down and tap the button again, you get just a tiny bit of lift, which is great for positioning your needle in the exact start position you need. Then, if you hit the down needle, that will keep your needle in the down position when you stop sewing, so you can pivot carefully around the needle to get this fine curve. I've also got my stitch speed turned way down so I don't make any mistakes when I'm doing this fine 1/16 of an inch curve around the thumb. And you can get right down to the edge of the seam and hit your tie off to do a clean little tack stitch, and then your machine trims your threads and pulls them to the back for a really nicely finished seam. You just snip the threads and you're pretty much good to go. Even with this one simple seam sewn up, when you turn it right side out, you can see how it's starting to be a glove. Since I already added contact cement around the bottom edge of the thumb and the glove thumb opening, now I can go ahead and press these seam allowances together to fit them in place. Start with the obtuse pointed angle on your thumb pattern, and with right sides together, press your seam allowances together and attach them just as you would as if you were pinning it, but the contact cement will hold your seam together evenly all the way along the edge with no gaps and no pins to sew over. So press all the way along, making sure the seams match, and get that all the way up into the acute angle on the other side of the thumb opening. With your thumb hole totally set in using the contact cement, start at the acute angle side of your thumb and using a straight stitch, go around that opening. Another tool I use when sewing is an awl. I use this almost as an extension of my fingers to push material under the sewing machine foot where my fingers can't reach, and to aim and hold material steady as it is fed into the machine. Turned right side out, the thumb seam will now look like this. You can start to see how this funny diamond shape is going to fit into the cut of the thumb pattern. So turn everything back inside out now so you can more easily use your contact cement to align these edges. Well, snip any threads that you've missed first, and then line everything up. I start with the acute side again and press your seam allowances together carefully, getting the corners right into the edges of the cut side of the thumb and working your way along the crazy diamond shape of this thumb gusset. The awl is great also for aligning anything that is getting stuck underneath. It's really like having a tiny metal finger. It's good for lots of things. Once everything is satisfactorily glued into place along your diamond gusset, you start on the acute side again, but I like to sew it with the diamond side up, and you start from right in the edge of the cut. The cut goes all the way here. Start as close to that as you can, and you'll kind of taper your seam allowance to 1/16 as you go. So slide this under your machine. Use your awl to position it as carefully as possible. You can get that really dialed in before you start sewing. And you'll sew along each edge of that diamond gusset really carefully. This is probably the trickiest part of the whole glove. So get that tack started, and you'll sew right to the point of the diamond, Use your extra lift on the foot here to make that go up higher, because now with your needle down, you want to take everything and pivot it to the other side. So you're pushing all your seam allowances underneath and rotating the seam around your needle and opening it up so you can sew along the next arm of the diamond. Take your time and go slowly. Turn the speed way down on your machine. Make sure all your seam allowances are still glued in place and where they're supposed to be, so you can avoid having to tear it out and try again later. Once you get to the end of the second leg of the diamond, lift your foot extra high, pivot, and repeat until you get to the edge of the thumb hole that you've already sewn. Now when everything is turned right side out, your thumb gusset will look like this. Here's the acute angle. You should check to make sure there's no ripples or puckers or gaps. I definitely didn't get this right the first time I tried it, so don't feel bad if you don't either. Next we'll move on to doing the elastic across the wrist and the Velcro that will hold the gold and gem cuff closed when you're wearing the glove. Transfer your placement markings to the back side of the glove and get your 1/4 inch elastic. This is going to be sewn between these points to make a gather across the wrist for a little bit more fit in your glove. Just take a pin and secure one end of the elastic to the far marking point. I switched the stitch here to an elastic zigzag with the widest stitch possible, and now I'm securing the end of the elastic, removing the pin, and you stretch the elastic and hold the other edge and then stitch over the elastic while it's stretched. This, when you release it, will give a nice gather that will help fit your glove around your wrist. Tie off, trim the threads, and voila! There is your elastic on the inside with the stretch, and on the outside you have a nice little gather. Sew a small square of Velcro just under the elastic on the glove cuff. I've switched back to a very basic straight stitch in this area, just to go around the edges of the Velcro and permanently secure it in place. Next thing to do is sew in the fourchettes. These are the pieces that go between your fingers. They look like this. The tricky part to these is that there is a long side and a short side because of this dart in the middle. This is the shorter side, and this is a longer side. Anatomically, this is so it can fit the deeper V on the back of your hand as opposed to the shorter one on the front where your webbing is. So the dart allows it to sit right into that shape of your fingers, and you just need to keep track of which side of the glove you're sewing the long edge to. So this is the back of the hand, and you'll sew the long edge to there, and you can tell that it's the back of the hand because it's not the side where the elastic is. That goes across your wrist under your palm, and also the thumbs fold inward like your thumb does. Take out your contact cement again, and as we did with the thumb hole, you'll be running a thin line of glue along the long edge of the fourchette and the long edge on the back side of the fingers. When the cement is dry on the back side of your fingers and also on the corresponding fourchettes, it's time to glue those together. You do this by folding the fourchette in half to find the midway point, which is right there, and then you get right down into the end of that cut and push it to stick. Then open up the fingers pretty wide and flat and walk that seam allowance along, pressing as you go. Go all the way up into the finger where the curve of the fourchette should match the curve at the end of your fingertip, and then walk it along the other side to do the same over there. Now your first fourchette seam should be glued all the way along the edge and right down into the curve at the bottom. Before sewing it up, I was using my metallic pen to put little dots where my stopping points are. So this is at the end where the fourchette meets the fingers and at that bottom curve. This is so I can more easily see where to start and stop and or pivot at the corner. So we're using a tack stitch. This is a simple straight stitch with a 2 stitch per inch, and then about an inch away from this corner I push it down to 1.5 or 1 stitches per inch to really stabilize that V. Open your fingers up really wide coming out of the corner so you don't catch the fourchette underneath. And again, about an inch away, I'll push it back up to 2 stitches per inch and finish off sewing the end of that finger. This is what it looks like now that it's sewn up. Not too different than how it was glued, but this is a permanent seam. You can see that you go right down into that V shape, and when you open it up, you should have a really smooth corner with nothing caught in that seam there. The next thing we're going to do is sew up the dart. So all you do for that is flip everything right sides together, and all you'll be doing is sewing just that little bit from the end right to the point of the dart. So be careful to get right to the end there for a really clean finish. So get that all under your machine, position it really carefully. I use my awl as kind of a target and to push the seam allowances down before tacking it off. When you open it up on the right side, this is what it should look like. You've got your darts sewn in that fourchette, and everything comes to a nice clean point in that V between the fingers. Next step is to repeat on the other 2 fingers. Go ahead and sew those, and then we'll be folding the glove in half and doing the back. I haven't sewn up the other backs of the fingers here yet, but when you have, this is how you'll sew the fourchettes along the palm side of the glove. You can see I've put contact cement in my seam allowances again along the fourchette seam as well as the palm fingers. You fold these in and press along your seam allowances as usual. I like to do the tips first to make sure those align, and then walk inward toward the V. Make sure the point of the V hits right where your seam in the dart is, and go down the other side, pressing as you go. Make sure it's even and wobble free. You've probably figured out the drill by now. Now that we've got our seam glued up, it will look like this, and we're going to take it to the machine to sew it. Just make sure all your seam allowances are where they should be at this point. I prefer to sew along the glove side so you can really see that V that you're supposed to hit when you get to the corner. So use your awl to flatten the seam allowance back from the other end. Get right to the tip of your glove and position it. Sew carefully around the finger curve, and then down the sides of the fingers, again using a 2 stitch per inch, reducing it in the V, getting right to that point, opening your fingers up wide and stitching out of that curve, switching back to a longer stitch, and down the end to the fingers. Here's that seam shown from the wrong side of the glove, and when you flip it right side out, you have something that looks like this. There's the finger gusset sewn to the tip of the finger. There's your dart, and it continues on up into the other finger. When you put it on, you've got a finger and a thumb. Pinchy, pinchy, pinchy. As I mentioned before, I do prefer to sew all the back sides of the fourchettes and then all the front sides, because when you're sewing the front sides, you can consecutively go around each finger of the glove, go up one side, down to the V, then up around the finger, and you keep going until you get to the pinky, and then you sew right down the edge of the glove as I'm doing here. So I'm going to pause for a minute so we can mark where this cuff will be sewn into the edge. Take the metallic pen again, and I'm just marking across from where the Velcro is. And then I'm going to continue to insert the cuff and sew along this edge. Now pay attention, I am sewing this in upside down here. I didn't video me correcting it, but just so you know when you're watching this, flip your cuff the other way around, otherwise it's going to be backwards like it is in the next segment of the video. But if you have your cuff inserted right side up, you just go ahead and sew all the way down the seam. A nice simple straight stitch. This is probably the simplest and most satisfying part of the glove. I clearly didn't even bother to put contact cement or pin this seam, which is not the best thing, but it should be so easy at this point that you can probably get away with it. This is what happens when you sew your cuff in upside down. Bummer. But that's what seam rippers are for. And you just rip up a bit and voila, cuff is right side up again. And here's what appropriately installed gem bracelets look like sewn onto your gloves. The Velcro tab and elastic through the wrist allow your hand to get into the glove easily and still maintain a slightly fitted look through the wrist. I'm not going to go much in depth on the fur cuff here. Basically, if you flip it inside out, you can see that I sewed the leather facing and the fur part along these side seams here, and then I joined them both at the wide edge, right sides together, turn that inside out, then with the right sides of the fur cuff and the glove sewn together along the more narrow edge, I used a wobble stitch to sew the seam together. This allows a little bit of stretch in the seam. After that, I used a basic zigzag stitch along the top edge to overcast and trap the raw edge of the faux fur so that it won't touch my skin and be scratchy on the inside of the glove. And with those final finishing steps, you have yourself a pair of gloves. Just Velcro the bracelet shut, shake off the extra fur, and now you're ready to rock. Peace, love, yeah. See you next time. Bye.